Thank you all for coming. And what is it? I love this the crisp Scandinavian climate here. That's why I always come back to Oregon. What was it? Was it 100 degrees today? Let's see. Is there more water? Yes. I'm big on water. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a book about politics back in. You know, you're not supposed to litter in Oregon. I'll pick it up later. Okay. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book about politics back in my home state of Kansas, and in particular about the ordinary people who've signed up for the conservative movement because it seems to take their side in the culture wars. And while I was finishing up the work on that book, I moved to Washington, D.C., and I eventually decided that I would write about the rest of the story, about the politicians that those Heartland voters, my Heartland homies back in Kansas, have put in place in Washington, and what those politicians have proceeded to do to the government over the last 3 decades. Now, examining the conservative movement in power is actually a lot more interesting than it sounds at first, because part of this movement's official dogma is that it never actually is in power. Right? That the movement can never really be held responsible for the misdeeds of its leaders, once they get caught up in scandal or their numbers plummet to like all-time lows or whatever it is. For example, take our current president, who a few months ago, actually it was back in April, had the lowest approval rating of any president since polling began. But having adored George W. Bush once, and I mean they really adored him. Do you remember, it was just a few years ago, I came across a little bit of conservative ephemera. It was a picture of Bush praying, and on one side he had George Washington, and on the other side he had Abraham Lincoln, and they adored this guy. But now that his numbers are in the toilet, they just tossed him overboard, and they call him an imposter, a man who somehow tricked the movement into accepting him. Now what's funny is if you go all the way back to the 1980s, the movement even gave this same treatment to Ronald Reagan, who was, the sort of patron saint, the great leader of the conservative movement through all those decades. But once, during the '82 recession, once his numbers got bad, they were saying, he's become a puppet of the moderates, of Deaver and Baker and that sort of thing. And so he's not really part of our movement anymore. Of course, now that he's been made into a saint, he's back in their good graces, and they accept him as one of their own again. All right, so that was a joke, actually. They didn't really make him a saint. So what I decided I would do is brush aside all of this sort of, blame evasion, this self-exculpating pedophagy. And instead I would judge conservatism by what it does when it manages to squeeze itself behind the controls of the state, how it behaves, who it serves, how it explains itself, and most importantly of all, why it does the things that it does. Now, the first thing that I noticed after I moved to Washington, and you all have noticed it too, is the Niagara of scandal that's been cascading down over the Capitol nearly constantly since I moved there. A few weeks ago, the big story was Senator Ted Stevens. Remember, you know who he is. A few days before that, it was the crazy politicized hiring at the Department of Justice, which is just a story that it would be impossible to invent. And the most notorious, though, and the one that really captured my imagination is the grotesque and colorful Jack Abramoff affair. The story of this sort of, fanatical right-winger who bribed his way through Congress and cheated his clients at the same time. Very entrepreneurial sort of figure. And I really mean that, very entrepreneurial. But you all know there's been countless others. I mean, we could go around the room and list off our favorites. Congressmen earmarking money for campaign contributors, congressmen sending tens of millions of dollars to guys trying to build, a supersonic jet in their backyard. Even a congressman who wrote up on his congressional letterhead a price list of what various bribes would buy from him. That was Duke Cunningham, by the way. NPR thinks I go too hard on Duke Cunningham. Look, the reason that scandals like these are so reprehensible in a system like ours is because the first principle of democracy is that the government and its workforce exist to serve the people, not any particular special interest. Yes, Republicans and Democrats may fight over how big government should be and exactly what it should do, we reassure ourselves, but almost everyone back there in D.C. shares the same baseline good intentions. So when things go wrong, we say it's just bad luck, or it's the presence of a few rotten apples, or it's just a bunch of imposters masquerading as conservatives. They've somehow tricked the conservative movement. These guys have fooled everybody. Now, I've come to a very different conclusion, and this is what the Wrecking Crew is all about. Fantastic misgovernment of the kind that we've seen over the last 8 years, and actually if you go back 28 years, fantastic misgovernment like this is not an accident, and it's not the work of a few bad individuals, and it's not the result of some complicated conspiracy, in which the conservative movement is somehow taken over by leftists masquerading as right-wingers. This wave of scandal, I decided, is as much a product of conservative attitudes towards governing as were the feeble efforts of FEMA after the hurricane hit New Orleans. Each of these things is an accurate expression of the essence of American conservatism, which is always, first and foremost, to serve the interests of business. This movement that I'm talking about understands the liberal state as a perversion, and it considers the market to be the ideal nexus of human society. It's friendly, I'm going to shift the water, it's friendly to industry not just by force of campaign contributions, but by conviction. It believes in entrepreneurship not merely in commerce, but also in politics. And, of course, it hates and despises government. Remember how President Reagan used to claim to find terror in the phrase, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Or how the humorist P.J. O'Rourke, who's actually a very funny guy, in his book about Washington, he sort of concludes with this scene in which he describes the proceedings of a New England town meeting, the very cradle of American democracy, but that the proceedings of a New England town meeting are a form of thievery because they're a form of government, right? Now, what kind of government do you get from a movement that mistrusts government's ability to get things done? The short answer, as everybody in the room's figured out by now, is lousy government, right? With health and safety codes unenforced and labor law gone missing, and incompetence on a heroic scale, and an occupation of Iraq so ill-planned that it might be described as a catastrophe. Governments like our present one routinely appoint industry lobbyists to run the regulatory departments overseeing those very same industries. They put people hostile to a particular branch of government, say Social Security Administration, in charge of that branch of government. And there's examples of this that come up all the time, and in the talk tonight I'm just going to stick to the ones that are kind of amusing, although I think that's the wrong word for what we're talking about here. But examples come up all the time. I mean, think about how our banking regulators completely missed, the crisis in bad mortgage debt.